Well, welcome everybody. I'll introduce myself. I'm Emma G. I'm the Arts Officer at Orkney Islands Council, and I'll hand over to my colleagues.
Hi, I'm Liz. I'm Liz Connacher from the National Galleries of Scotland.
And Clare, and I'm Creative Learning Officer at Stirling Council.
And we found ourselves together in a very interesting conversation, partly because we were brought together by Paul from Hidden Giants to do an application that actually fell on stony ground. But what didn't fall on stony ground was the relationship. And we found ourselves in some very interesting conversations. So if I could have the first slide of my presentation, if that's all right. It'll turn up in a minute. Mine's terribly linear. We'd begun talking about creativity, obviously in schools. It's what bound us together. And the conversation Liz and I found ourselves in was, how on earth do we get, or how on earth does Orkney get some value out of National Galleries Scotland when it's way up where it is and not on the doorstep? And I'm sure that Clare was also interested, what with Stirling not being on the doorstep. This is what emerged. So if I could have my second slide, please, that would be grand. I won't read it all out. You can all have a little look at this. But what we discovered, Liz and I, was that over in Orkney, the £4.4 million Scapa Flow Museum was getting created. And over in mainland, National Galleries Scotland were developing their galleries, and I'll let Liz speak about those. And we were both realising we had exactly the same problem, that the interpretation of what was going into those spaces probably wasn't going to speak volumes to our children. And what National Galleries Scotland were doing was preparing a little kind of pilot test of how could they address that. And I wanted to work in a very deep way, creatively, with the brilliant school in Hoare, where the museum is based, North Walls School, with the then fantastic head, Shirley. And we wondered whether or not that pilot programme could become a test ground. So if I could have the next slide, please. We could see that that notion could really embody this refreshed notion of what creative learning was all about, really picking up on that notion of conscious creativity. You can have a very quick gander at that, but I'm going to go on to the next slide. So when we see this next slide, what you're seeing here is Mara from the engagement team at National Galleries Scotland and Freya, who's a curator at National Galleries Scotland, now in Orkney at the North Walls School, having brought this pilot over as a training to produce junior curators of the children at North Walls School. And what they're doing here is looking very deeply at some of the collection from the National Gallery. If we go on to the next slide, the intent behind it is what's written out here. You know, it's looking deeply at pictures, thinking about what artists might mean. What we were able to do while we had Mara and Freya here in Orkney is exploit them wonderfully. So they spent two very long mornings, 2 consecutive mornings at North Walls, but we also had them over at Kirkwall Grammar School. And what that did was able us to just actually have an ability to see the difference between placing them in the primary and a secondary context. And you'll see how that has opened up a much wider dialogue between the three of us around what you can achieve with this notion of kind of creative curriculum, and what the intent is behind the Creative Learning Network's sort of refresh, and where that kind of pushes back in terms of the structures within which this is being attempted. If we have a look at the next slide. So if you've got this mission to do this embedding of creativity, where all learners are empowered and creative and confident, what is pushing back at you within the extant structures within which you are working? Because if you know, the previous slide looked at an environment in which it was being, well, you know, fostered beautifully. We go on to the next slide. You know, that embedding of creativity in the curriculum design is something that North Wales is pioneering wonderfully, and is really exploring in terms of pupil-led curriculum design. Well, brilliant. That's working extremely well. That's not necessarily a given everywhere. If we can move on to the next slide, that would be fantastic. So here, where there is the scope for this pupil-led development, what happened next in North Wales was our museum's curator, Ellen, who does look like she's trying to escape the room at this point. I promise you she isn't. And myself, who looks like got the largest bum in the universe over there, we came and did a follow-up workshop with the kids. So they've had the basic generic training from National Gallery Scotland. So they've had, you know, this notion of embedding the basics around what being a curator may well be. And what they're doing here is working on a specific artifact that will be in the Scapa Flow Museum, which is the dome painting by Jim Bakey, who happens actually to be Ellen's dad. That painting will be the only artifact cited in the education space at Scapa Flow Museum, and the education space is the space that these children were the consultants for the design in the museum the summer previously. So we're here in November. That summer they came on site when it was a hard hat high vis site. It was facilitated by Orkney Builders, who really embraced the kids being on a hard hat site. We facilitated that during COVID. And they'd done their research with their head teacher, Shirley, and they talked very clearly about them wanting the space not to be boring. They wanted not boring defined as colourful. And they'd done research into the fact that the architect was going to use dazzle design. So dazzle is the use of camouflage on the boats in Scapa Flow that breaks up the sides of the boats so that U-boats and aeroplanes don't see them as great sides of planes, of, you know, so that they can be attacked. But what they noted was, although all the photographs show them in black and white, actually dazzle wasn't entirely black and white, and they'd found some colour images, and so they'd taken their colour palette from that. So they presented that to the architect in a mood board, and indeed that's exactly how that space is now designed. So as experts at being their age, they met experts to discuss that, and that's how they've influenced the design in the museum. Here they've taken the themes of the arts, and they're currently taking this idea of their favourite place in Hoare and embodying that writ large. What they're doing here is working as solo artists, but collaborating in a space where they're negotiating, fitting their favourite place into this space, where they're overcoming the fact that they're going to overlap in terms of boundary. They will also use each other as audience when they discuss what they've produced, and see how their audience responds to what they've produced, and find out whether what they've produced reads before they then label it, and understand how they must support audiences in terms of interpretation. So there's a lot of understanding why we use interpretation going on. So it's a very active and very cooperative, but also self-defined kind of piece of work going on. So we'll go on to the next slide. There you are. That's what they're doing. If we go on to the next slide, they're doing this. Creativity in action. However, this is where the experience of running the initial workshop in the primary and the secondary context started to separate. With the experience in a primary, this kind of work and this follow-up workshop, which we didn't do in the secondary context, would have actually struggled to be as free. It's not that it couldn't have taken place, but it would have struggled to be free. What we discovered in the initial workshop is that partnering was something that actually the context of the secondary school that we're working was actually something that the staff themselves struggled with. I don't think the pupils were struggling with it, but the staff found it very difficult. They wanted individualism. So that idea of kind of working in a collaborative way was problematic for them. If we can have the next slide. So when you've got key principles like this that you're trying to foster, how much are you working laterally as you go up the scale in education? Are you going to find it pushes back and thwarts? We can have the next slide. So this, just very quickly, is what I was referring to in the previous one. This is the point at which the children have produced their pieces of work, and what they're facing here is their audience reflecting on their work before they're able to explain what it is themselves, and so they can hear what they've got across and what they may now need to get across to get the specifics across. So we had one of these images was very clearly a living room. What wasn't so clear was it wasn't their own personal living room, it was their grandparents' living room, and that was very important about their favourite place in Hoare. That it wasn't their mum, their own home living room, it was their grandparents' living room. So those sorts of nuances of how interpretation then is really important, because what we wanted to move on to is why you have labels, why you have interpretation in gallery and in museum contexts. Because if you remember, these are our junior curators we're training. Next slide, please. I think a byproduct of this amount of agency is inevitably this. I'll say no more about that, but it's something you can kind of come back on. Next slide, please. Again, we started in the first workshop to see how different the two contexts were, and that was just one workshop in two different contexts in two different schools. It's not to say that in a secondary context you can't achieve creativity. Absolutely you can, but those workshop leaders, Mara and Freya, had to put in so much work to get out the results. I mean, infinitely more than the work they were putting in at North Wolds. Once it began to take hold, you could see that response, and therefore you could start to see the well-being and the agentic nature coming up. But it was very tentative. It was as if to author was something that was quite alarming. If we can have the next slide, please. So, if your commitment, and I think it should be there, is collaborating, empowerment and embedding those, how much are your systems actually mitigating that intent? Have the next slide. So here you can see the children at North Walls had already done some very detailed work influenced by Jim Bakey's painting. And what they were doing here in the workshop with Ellen and I is moving on to creating written labels. So we're into kind of literacy, but we didn't talk about literacy per se. So at this point, there's absolutely no qualms that they've moved into writing. They're now writing labels. We've experienced this idea of making a space and realizing that if your audience doesn't fully understand it, you've got to do some more explaining. Now they've got the artwork. They've just leapt into understanding that they better do some explaining. Otherwise, people are going to look at their paintings and not quite understand what they want to get across if they don't drive their audience to it. But I'll have the next slide. I then did a whole day session with the children that was entirely about finessing those labels so that they could put them in a public context alongside these paintings. I mean, an entire day of literacy around generating labels, which had exactly this intensity of engagement. No qualms about it. I was absolutely stunned about the level of engagement. And I'm just offering you Ruby's here, which I will read because I think it's beautiful. I could have picked anybody's, and they were like poems, but they all understood that a label would contain a title. It contained a name, it contains the materiality of what you're looking at, and then a descriptor. So here is The Rainbow Juice by Ruby, which is paint and pencil on paper. The oil tanks were dark and hidden from people. They used it in the wars for oil fuel. They were invisible to everyone that lived close to it. Most of the oil was used up, but they emptied it out. But there were little puddles of it that looked like it was a rainbow. Then it became a fabulously ordinary playground for children. We would hide from all the other children and shout out silly words to make echoes. This was our playground now. Then we invited other kids to the old tank and we'd sit on the ladder steps and talk. I hope they never have to fill up the tank again. And what we're learning here is that interpretation by children may not be the same thing as interpretation by adults for adults, and nor should it be. And it won't be at Scapa Flow Museum. And we may not even have it on paper. There may be another medium by which we will transmit this. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. I think you can see that it's happening. Next slide, please. This idea of authorship, I just want to say it's happening with these children. And it's too early to say whether we would get this take up in a secondary context. But what we were seeing in that first workshop is almost a reticence to own, to author. Next slide, please. Here we're seeing Mara and Freya certificating our junior curators, and they have subsequently been called junior curators since their certification. Next slide, please. We want this notion of quality to resonate. Next slide, please. This notion of celebration, this sense of pride, this sense of value is really critical. So that certification was very important. We didn't have that scope but in the secondary context, but what we did do, what Mara and Fred did do, and I think was very important, is that everybody went away with a very high quality sketchbook. And you could hear the buzz of, this is just for me. We can take this. We don't have to leave this at the school. This is, you know, that sense of value was very important, I think. We also know the staff are borrowing that workshop and will be using it. So value was 360 in that context. Next slide, please. it may, but I think the systems need some work to foster it in certain in the context within which we work. It's not as free and easy, and it pushes against how things could be. The final slide, please. I want to finish off with this. This is the culmination of where we're at with the junior curators right now. On the 11th, the junior curators came down to the Scapa Flow Museum. It's still not got its casing and stuff. That's being built as we speak. But we wanted to let the community in. So they came down on the Friday. They saw the education space as a result of their consultancy, so they were able to see that and reflect on whether or not we'd achieved what they'd asked of it. Was it not boring? Was it colourful? Had it responded to their mood board and their research? They then put their exhibition up, and so in between their images, I think you can see their labels. So that's the work that they'd done. That all went up, and then that afternoon the Hoare Community Council were in. So that very afternoon, the very first public sighting of their work. So they're the first exhibition in the space. The following day, the entirety of the island could come in. Well, it was delightful, and that you're seeing Hamish there at the front desk. That wasn't an organised thing. It was just, I'm not a museums expert, I'm the arts officer. I was given the clicker and the job of being on the front desk because the museum staff were populating the museum spaces so they could talk knowledgeably about those spaces. Within minutes, the children that were accompanying their families had got the clicker, were operating the track and trace information, were informing people where the volunteer forms were, and then we're starting to run the tours. And I was utterly superfluous to requirement. And, I think that's how it should be. I pass on to my colleague, Liz.
Thanks very much, Emma. So that was great, Emma, to hear about a specific example of a project where National Galleries were able to offer a little bit of support to a brilliant project that was already running in Orkney and working with a specific a group of schools to do that. I'm going to talk a little bit about a resource, a project that we've been working on, which is open to all schools, families, all young people in Scotland, and how you can get involved in that, or your young people can get involved in that if you want to. And then I'm going to hand over to Clare at the end, and she's going to round us off and bring in a little bit of discussion. But we would like to find out a little bit about you, wherever you are and whatever your context is that you work in. We said that today's session was about looking at creativity in the context of visual arts, and we're really interested in getting a sense of the picture as you see it across Scotland. So wherever you are, whatever it is that you do, we'd love it if you could put a little bit in the chat about maybe just where you're from and what do you think is needed in your area to improve visual arts education. You might think it's all perfect and there's nothing that's needed. That's brilliant. Tell us that. But if there are things that you think could be better in your area, then tell us what those might be. So do you think there are enough art materials in the schools in your area? Maybe you do or don't know these things, but if you've got any insights to these. Is there more training needed for teachers in the visual arts? Do we need more art specialists in schools? Maybe there's something else that you think is missing in visual arts education in Scotland. So put it into the chat. We'd love to hear if you can do that while I'm chatting away. Isabel, could I get my slides up, please? Thanks to Isabel for doing all the hard work here. So I'm going to talk about a project that's called Your Art World, and it's a project we've been piloting over the last over a year now. It's for 3 to 18-year-olds. Families can take part, schools can take part, young people can take part at home, whatever they want to do. And it's to encourage children, young people to make and share their own artwork. And the ambition behind this is all about encouraging creative thinking through the arts. And that's because we know that not every art lesson is creative. And I'm not saying that they all should be creative, but what I do know from talking to teachers is that very often the art lessons are not necessarily creative in schools. It's very common, it seems, for teachers to start an art lesson by showing the class the thing that they're about to make. So the teacher has predetermined what their art should look like. Now that's fine if you're demonstrating a particular skill or a particular technique that you want the group to learn, but art isn't just about those end products. It's not just about making wall displays. It's about process too. And we wanted to offer this resource as a way of supporting people to really enjoy that creative process and not be overly worried about the end product. It's not just about direct instruction, it's about experimentation, it's about child-led inquiry, and it's about a child having their own voice and being able to communicate their own ideas visually or through other means as well. We're not just looking at visual art here, we're looking at, we welcome art in the broader sense to be included in your art world. So I'm going to explain to you a little bit about how your art world tries to encourage children and young people to have their own voice. So this is what it looks like on our website. It's called Your Art World Make and Share. If you look at the headings along the bottom of the screen there, you'll see it's split into 5 sections. So first of all, there are challenges. Now these are set by children and young people around Scotland for children around Scotland. And we've been asking different groups of young people to come up with themes that they think will inspire other 3 to 18-year-olds to make art. The second part is called Get Started, and that's it's full of practical help for teachers or for parents to help them scaffold learner-led inquiry and experimentation, creative experimentation. And once your learners have made some art, you can click on Share Your Art, and that's where you can upload files to an online gallery. The online gallery is it's called Your Art, that's the next section. If you are a teacher out there, just so you know, we're offering prizes of £100 for art materials to schools and nurseries who do upload their art. And what we mean by art, it can be anything. We're looking for art in the broadest sense. It can be 2D or 3D, it can be film, animation, creative writing, it could be performance, it could be audio files. Anything that you can put in a file and send to us will be included in the online gallery. And the last section there is all the past challenges. So these are the past themes, challenges that have been set by other groups of children and young people around Scotland. Could we have the next slide, Isabel? So the challenges look like this. New challenges go live every 6 months, and the current deadline is the end of June. So I'll let you read through, you can see what's there. There's 4 types of challenge to choose from, and this is about giving learners choice so that they can choose to respond to any or all of them that they feel inspired by. So there's always a question, there's always a word, and there's always a picture. And these are intended just as an initial prompt, something to start the imagination, something to start the creative process. And the children that have chosen these believe that these will inspire other people to make art. And by the way, if you have a group that you think would like to help us set one of these challenges, then please do get in touch. I'll put my contact details in the chat at the end. The current question is, what will the planet look like in 100 years' time? So the challenge there is to make something, to make an artwork inspired by that question. We've got the word showcase, and again, the challenge is to make something inspired by that word showcase. The group that chose this word, they thought it would be inspiring because it would encourage people to show off or showcase their best artworks. And the picture challenge, I'm going to show you the picture in a minute, but the final one there is called freestyle, and it's a really important part of the process here, because we want to give this choice. We want to give choice to children and young people and encourage them to think for themselves. So freestyle invites you to choose any theme that you like, any topic that you're inspired by. And it can also be that if a teacher is already exploring a particular topic with a class in school, then they can send us art on that topic that they're already investigating, and that can be submitted as part of the freestyle challenge. Could we have the next slide, Isabel? So this is what the current picture challenge looks like, and this comes from a primary 1 class in Kirstdorfen, and they felt that they'd gone through a process, they'd experimented with making lots of images, and they decided this was the most inspiring image that they had created as a class. We ask each group that sets a challenge to make a wee video to describe and explain their challenge and why they think it's going to inspire others. Could we have the next slide? And these are just some examples of the artworks that have been made this term inspired by that picture. Sometimes you can see an obvious connection to the theme or the prompt image. Sometimes you can, and that's absolutely fine. There's no selection process. We will share everything that gets submitted in the online gallery. And we really encourage people to use those prompts, those challenges as a starting point. Let the children's imagination take them wherever it wants to go, and we're not looking for an obvious connection to the original challenge theme. Could we have the next image, please? Next slide. These are some more of the images that are in the online gallery at the moment. It's just a small selection. You can click on the images to enlarge them and also to bring up descriptors if they've been sent in with the artwork. So the artists or the teachers can send us descriptors of what they've made or how they made it. Could we have the next slide, please? So this is what the Get Started section looks like. I'm not going to go into all the detail, but it's split into 3 sections. First, we've got how to grow ideas, and this is really simple prompts that can be used with any age group to support learners to generate multiple ideas, to think creatively about any word, any picture, or any question, and encourage them to use their imagination to explore that theme creatively. The one in the middle is called How to Experiment, and it's a series of short videos that demonstrate ways to play with different art materials. And the word play here is really important, play and experimentation. It's not about having a set idea or a set technique in mind. It's about figuring out for yourself, what can charcoal do? What can ink do? What can cardboard do? What can you do outdoors to make art? Just experimenting and playing with different ideas and materials. And finally, we've got Artists Meet the Challenge. Now, these are short videos that are made by artists. Every challenge that is set, we invite a different artist to respond to that challenge, and we ask them to make a short video demonstrating their creative process. And the artists that we've approached so far, they include writers, visual artists, dancers, and we've got a scientist in the next round of challenges coming up. So it's creative people in the broadest sense, so artists in the broadest sense. Could we have the next slide? Again, not going to go into all the detail, but how to grow ideas is split into 3 parts. So we're really trying to encourage that you go through a process of thinking and a process of wondering before you get to the stage of creating. It looks quite linear here, but of course it's not. The creative process is a kind of cyclical process that repeats again and again. So you might think and then wonder and create, but then you can go back to thinking again and wondering, and that then prompts you to create something else, and you go back to thinking about what you created. So it carries on. And in this process, we're trying to encourage this idea that with thinking and wondering, there's no such thing as a bad idea at those stages. It's about experimentation, making mistakes. You can mess things up. You can make a mess. That's okay, because you're going to get to a stage of refining and making decisions as you get closer to being ready to create your final piece. Could we have the next slide, please? I'm not going to play this, but just so you know what it looks like, this is one of the examples of the short videos about experimenting with materials. I'm going to put a link in the chat at the end, so if anybody wants to go away and look at that afterwards, they can do. Could we have the next slide? And this is an example of one of the artist videos. So this is the artist Heather Lucchese, and she's responding to the picture prompt, the picture challenge that you saw earlier. So we asked the artist to demonstrate their process. It's not about demonstrating a finished product that they've made, but these short videos are full of ideas that you could use with learners for yourself. And again, I'm going to put a link to this in the chat afterwards. Next slide. This is the final part of the web resource that's available. So if you want them, we've sourced images from the National Galleries of Scotland collection that we think connect in some way to the challenges that have been set by children and young people. So these are some of the images that we sourced that could be said to connect to the picture challenge that you saw earlier. So the feedback that we've had from groups who've been helping us pilot this is that the one thing that comes up again and again is that people really value having a time in the school day when they get to do their own thing, when they get to make their own decisions and think for themselves, because it's something that they're not used to experiencing in the school day. It's fun. It makes them feel good. We know that there's health and well-being benefits to being creative and to making art. It gives them a way to express ideas that matter to them. And they're excited to see their work then shared on a national platform as well. It encourages listening and talking, respecting other people's opinions, questioning, curiosity, imagination, problem solving, and it can be interdisciplinary as well. It doesn't just need to be in the art subjects. Everything that I've shown you is available online, but we also have other aspects to your art world. We've got monthly workshops for families. We'll be starting workshops for schools in the gallery soon as well. And we're planning professional learning sessions for teachers that will also start in the new financial year. In 2023, we're also going to have an exhibition for the first time in Edinburgh. I see questions just popped up there in the chat as well. Your Art World replaces the former art competition for schools. Your Art World is not competitive, but we hope that we've kept the elements, the aspects of the art competition that people told us they liked. So there will be exhibitions of children's work in the gallery. There will be an online gallery. There is an online gallery as well. There are challenges for you to respond to, but we've opened it up in a way that we hope it gives people what they were looking for. When we consulted about the art competition, people told us they wanted more flexibility, so they wanted more choice of themes. They wanted to be able to respond in different art forms, not just 2D art of a particular size. So your Art World opens the doors and says, you send us what you want to send us. All sizes, all shapes, all kinds of artwork are welcome. I'm happy to answer any other questions. I'll check and see if there's anything else that's come into the chat there. But yeah, if you've got any questions about your art world or how to take part, then do get in touch. It's all live on the website now. I'm going to put links in the chat. Yeah, we'd love to get your feedback as well, or any suggestions, or get in touch if you would like your class or your group to help set one of the challenges in future. And I'm going to hand over to Clare.